Hello, friends, and welcome to the show. This episode, I'm going to start off by talking about the Lincoln Project's avowed ignorance of Weaver texts undercut by leaked communications. So, if you don't know what happened before, basically, it's found out that Weaver, one of the co founders of the Lincoln Project, who was also making $1.5 million a year, was basically sending sexually explicit texts to teenage boys in the hopes of grooming them. And not only that, the Lincoln Project pretended to not know about it, but it turns out they have known about it since last summer, but they still kept him on board, I'm assuming, so they could still kill the Trump. So let's get started on this. The Lincoln Project's leaders, amid the unfolding scandal of co founder John Weaver soliciting sexual favors from young men, have asserted that they were unaware of his indiscretions until last month. But electronic communications obtained by the Washington Blade call that claim into question and suggest some Lincoln Project executives knew about the texts as early as last summer, but took no substantive action in response. The communications with Lincoln Project officials undermined the assertions that there was no awareness or insinuations of any type of inappropriate behavior when we became aware of the chatter at the time. As co-founder Steve Schmidt told the New York Times last month, these electronic messages which date back to August 2020 and include Lincoln Project co-founder Mike Madrid, showed that leadership was made aware of allegations about Weaver from reporters who were investigating it and had begun discussions of how to respond to any fallout. So, this is bananas. So, I believe that the Lincoln Project should be investigated from this. If they knew for nearly 6 months that they had a pedophile on their, basically is as a co-founder on the board, as a major member as a heavy hitter of the Lincoln Project, if they still had them on board, and once they knew he was a pedophile, once they knew he liked sending sexually explicit texts to children, they should have fired him on the spot. They should have smeared him on the spot because that is unacceptable. But no, instead, they thought it was more important to ensure that Trump lost the presidency. So, you know what should happen to these people? They should get sued for everything that they have. And not just the Lincoln Project, but each individual founder or each individual co founder should also be sued out of house and home because they're responsible for all those boys who received those inappropriate text messages. They are now complicit in the act of pedophilia. They are now complicit in the act of grooming of young boys from an old, creepy man. This is disgusting. And someone needs to be held accountable for this. And it should be the co founders of the Lincoln Project. One source close to the Weaver family and not affiliated with the Lincoln Project said that the announcement of medical leave wasn't a ruse and Weaver had in fact suffered a heart attack. So back in August, Weaver took a basically medical leave of absence. The Lincoln Project said that he had a heart attack, but it seemed pretty convenient. As soon as they found out that he liked to sext little boys, conveniently he had a heart attack. So questions are arising from that timing. But maybe it's he found out about it and he thought his world was going to end and he had a heart attack. That's definitely a possible scenario. In fact, suffered a heart attack at the time word of the planned story spread to the anti-Trump group. Weaver has a history of health issues and had missed appearances at Lincoln Project events due to stent procedures before COVID prevented further gatherings. The New York Post never published its article. The Blade is not publishing the messages in order to protect the confidentiality of its sources. The electronic messages the Blade reviewed were between Madrid and one of the young men Weaver was texting. So, one of the co-founders of the Lincoln Project was in direct communication with one of Weaver's victims and then pretended to not know about a pedophile in their ranks. So, like I said, the Lincoln Project and each of their members should be sued out of house and home. There should no longer be a Lincoln Project if they're just going to be a pedophile safe haven. It is unethical. It is unbelievable that in 2021 we are having this conversation that I guess because they are anti-Trump, and that apparently it's okay for them to be pro-pedophilia, but in the real world, where we can see beyond just Trump and Biden, where there's actually consequences for your actions, this person deserves to rot in jail for sexting young men, because that is disgusting on so many levels, both legally and ethically, just reprehensible. Madrid didn't respond to a request for comments for this article submitted to his associates at Grassroots Labs LLC, the public relations firm where Madrid works. We also did not respond to a question, or he did not respond to a question about whether he signed an NDA with the Lincoln Project. So basically says he can't talk about a story that was never published by the New York Post. So stop talking to me, fools. That's essentially what, I guess he's doing the correct PR thing. He's like, well, what is there to talk about? Where's your news story? Where's your sources? And they're like, well, we don't want to show our sources. We just, we're asking about this. But if you're denying to answer it, we're going to assume that you're guilty. So basically, if it's on its face false, then just admit that it's false. But if it's true and you refuse to answer it, then we're going to assume that it's true, and we're going to keep digging into it, and you're just going to keep finding yourself in a deeper and deeper hole, because we're going to get to the bottom of it. You wouldn't have said anything, and now it's going to look like you're a co-conspirator for a pedophile. Nonetheless, the existence of those early alerts, regardless of the source, were about sexually aggressive messaging in which gay men were survivors, and contradict the Lincoln Project's assertion that its leaders were only made aware of Weaver's indiscretions in the last month as the story gained traction. Other than Weaver taking medical leave as a result of a cardiac emergency, as word of the New York Post article reached the Lincoln Project, no action was announced against him in the middle of a campaign season. The New York Post didn't respond Tuesday morning to the Blade's request for comment on why it didn't run its article on Weaver. Meanwhile, the Lincoln Project, as part of its campaign against Trump, ran in July an ad highlighting his ties to alleged child trafficker Ghislaine Maxwell, condemning Trump for saying in a White House briefing, "I just wish her well, frankly. I've met her numerous times over the years." The ad shows images of Trump with Maxwell, highlighting their friendship. So I will touch on this. I believe Trump and Epstein lived in the same place, and they ran in the same circles because they both were filthy rich. So, not condoning his actions, but also when he says, "I wish her well," considering that Epstein magically died in his jail cell, and hashtag Epstein didn't kill himself is still, it still tends to trend on Twitter from time to time. It's very reasonable to expect the president to say, "I wish her well. I hope she doesn't magically find herself dead," because there's a lot of questions around Epstein's alleged suicide, because no one's 100% sure that he actually killed himself. Well, other than, the government. But everybody else seems to doubt it, including independent medical examiners who said, this isn't from hanging. This is from actually somebody breaking his neck while choking him out. So, it is what it is. So maybe he does wish her well. That way she can actually tell the damn story, as opposed to magically finding herself dead at some point. Denunciation of Weaver would have to wait until last week in the form of Lincoln Project statement calling him a predator, a liar, and an abuser, upon publication of New York Times article citing 21 men who accused Weaver of sexual predation online. None of the men have accused Weaver of criminal conduct. Well, I'm sorry, I'm pretty sure that it's questionable if you're having sexually driven speech towards a child. Steve Schmidt, in a phone interview last week, well, I guess perhaps not a criminal conduct, but definitely civil charges. Civil charges could be filed because it is emotional abuse. You can sue for damages. I would be interested to see how that would play out. Steve Schmidt, in a phone interview last week with The Blade, denied Lincoln Project had any knowledge of any misconduct by John Weaver until January. Schmidt also said no media outlet had submitted to the Lincoln Project a formal request for an on-the-record comment on the Weaver text, the story never published, and there was never an interrogatory put on the record, to my knowledge, to the organization by the New York Post. Schmidt downplayed Madrid's role in the organization, saying he was not part of the map with the Lincoln Project, even though Madrid identifies as a co-founder. If Madrid wasn't considered a leader at the Lincoln Project, he certainly was paid like one. According to Federal Election Commission reports, Madrid made at least $1.5 million from the Lincoln Project. The New York Times reported last month 21 men are accusing Weaver of sexual harassment in private messages to them. In the article, Lincoln Project leaders are quoted as saying that they were only made aware of Weaver's sexual solicitations in January as a result of news articles. I don't understand this with Democrats. Or I guess I guess I just don't understand this with garbage human beings who only tend to find out once there's actually documented evidence of them having found out 6 months prior, but they conveniently only find out of pedophiles and murdering of children and all of this stuff until they see it on the news. It's ridiculous. These people need to be held to account for this. One strategist who said he received sexual solicitations from Weaver said he knew him at first in a professional capacity. At that time, the strategist said Weaver did nothing to suggest he had an interest in men, let alone an interest in the strategist in particular. But several years after they met, the strategist said he received Twitter messages from Weaver and he made comments that were unwanted but strange. He never offered me like a quid pro quo or a job. That was never even part of the conversation. It was just very weird. I know a lot of people who said that was demeaning. I felt it was more sort of fatherly like. That's weird. Perhaps he was abused as a child. I mean, there's more than 25 years apart, but that's also because I knew him. But I could understand how that would be very disconcerting. Asked if anything sexually explicit came up, the strategist said Weaver had a lot of questions about my sex life, danced around the conversation, of course, because, well, for professional purposes. It's definitely weird. Like, okay, here's the Lincoln Project's statement. Last week, the Lincoln Project took a different tone, repudiating Weaver for sexual harassment of younger males and accusing him of having led a secret life that was built on a foundation of deception at every level. So, not really, because if this story is true and there is evidence that the Lincoln Project knew, they actually condone and tacitly supported pedophilia for 6 months. There's no question about it. He is a predator, a liar, and an abuser. The Lincoln Project statement says, "We extend our deepest sympathy to those who are targeted by his deplorable and predatory behavior. We are disgusted and outraged that somebody in a position of power and trust would use it for these means." Well, no, they're not disgusted, because if they were truly disgusted at his actions, then they would have canned him back in August when they found out, instead of just basically trying to destroy Trump, trying to claim that Trump was doing the same thing this guy was doing. No. These people support pedophilia by keeping this man on board. If they in fact knew back in August that he was sending sexually driven texts towards young men, they should have fired him on the spot. We don't want to be associated with people like that, because while we might support that lifestyle, right? So you say, hey, we support the LGBTQ lifestyle. Of course we do. However, we cannot condone one of our founding members sending sexually explicit texts to 14-year-old boys. That is unacceptable. Unacceptable. That is disgusting. You should be ashamed of yourself. You should go seek help. And while you're at it, go find another job, because we want nothing to do with you. That's what should have been done. But of course, they didn't do it because Orange Man was bad. So they condone pedophilia. That is disgusting. And the Lincoln Project should be sued also for sexual harassment, for their tacit condoning of pedophilia. Let's jump over to the 1619 Project founder, DOXES reporter, for questioning her about New York Times witch hunt, and it shows a screenshot of his tweet. Hannah Jones has taken down the tweet that contained my phone number. I appreciate that, but it took her over 24 hours to do so, and she clearly knew my number was out there. So before I get to the article, why don't you smash that like button, comment if you haven't already, and if you'd like to contribute to the show, please go to notcensoredyet.com/donate, where you'll find links available to help the show grow and produce more quality content free from outside influence. So let's get to this story. In an expose about the inner workings of debate among New York Times staff over the apparent forced resignation of science writer Donald McNeil Jr., it was revealed that 1619 Project founder Nicole Hannah-Jones doxed the reporter who covered the story for the Washington Free Beacon. Hannah-Jones felt empowered to punish Aaron's, I can't pronounce that last name, for having the audacity to ask her a question about her use of a racial slur, the same usage of which got her colleague ousted from the paper. Aaron wrote the article asking Hannah-Jones about the incident that led to McNeil's ouster from the paper. That incident, according to Aaron, went something like this. Some years ago, McNeil chaperoned a science trip for teens to Peru. So basically what happened on that, from my understanding, was a 12-year-old basically said, hey, somebody used the N-word in a video. Do you feel like they should be suspended? But they didn't say the N-word. They actually said the word. And McNeil basically said, well, in which context did they use the N-word? Again, he didn't say the N-word. He actually said the N-word. And so basically now, years later, he's being held to atone for that and basically just asking a question, basically asking, how was it used? In which context was it used? And it's definitely scary. And the statement that the New York Times then put out says, we do not tolerate racist language regardless of intent. So if you basically use that in a historical context, right? If you're using that to write a screenplay in a historical context, that type of language would be used. Well, they wouldn't tolerate that racist language. If you use that to report in a historical context, that language can't be used. I guess if you use that to report on social whatever, that language can't be used. So, with that being said, it was about this statement as regards to her own use of the term that Alex asked Hannah-Jones about. The basis for the question to Hannah-Jones was whether she agreed with Beckett, noting that Hannah-Jones had herself used the N-word in a Twitter exchange in 2016 in response to a Washington Post article about what is clearly some inside baseball. Hannah-Jones wrote, Larry Wilmore did not say, you did it, my... Come on now, right? So you can see, if you're watching on YouTube, you can see she actually used that language. So if the New York Times policy is we do not tolerate racist language regardless of intent, then Nicole Hannah-Jones should find herself without a job. Yet it only cuts one way, apparently, because she can then dox the reporter. She can release his phone number out to the public. Hannah-Jones was referencing Larry Wilmore's routine at the White House Correspondents' Dinner when President Barack Obama, in a follow-up, she wrote that there was a linguistic difference between what Wilmore said, a word which ends with an A, and what he was accused of saying, the slur which ends with an ER. Presumably, the former is more colloquial, jovial term, while the latter should get a journalist fired for the New York Times, even just for saying it once, which she did. She tweeted it, so she put it on paper, right? She literally wrote it down. And by on paper, I mean electronic paper, right? So she tweeted this out into the Twitterverse. And it's there forever. It is now screenshotted into a news article. It is now well established that a member of the New York Times used racist language. Regardless of intent, she should be fired. Let's have one standard. Multiple standards is disgusting. Multiple standards is what leads to this division that we currently have in the United States. Having these multiple standards only leads to conflict because you're going to have one side who benefits from that double standard. You're going to have one side who suffers from that double standard. And this sort of rhetoric, this sort of, okay, we're going to allow only this group of people to do this. If you're in the in group, if you are liberal enough, if you are the right color, if you are the right gender, if you are the right X, Y, or Z, then you can say or do whatever you want without consequence. However, if you do not fill all those intersectionality checkboxes, then God, watch your back, because as soon as you slip up, you will be canceled by the mob so quick your head will spin. Hannah Jones said it 2 times on the same day in 2016, as if Banquet said intent doesn't matter. Then Hannah Jones should undoubtedly be up next for recommended resignation. I did watch and did read the transcripts. This is from Nicole Hannah Jones. I'm saying you know the linguistic difference between the two forms of the N-word. Alex asked Hannah Jones about Banquet and her May 2nd, 2016 use of the offending N-word. Instead of engaging in the question of Alex, Hannah Jones punished him publicly. He asked Hannah Jones if, as Banquet said, intent was irrelevant in the case of her use of the unsavory word. He writes that the Washington Free Beacon asked Hannah Jones whether the intent made a difference in her case. She responded by posting this reporter's inquiry, including his cell phone number, on Twitter in direct violation of the website's terms of service. So she is also not banned from Twitter. She doxed a reporter. She disclosed his personal contact information online in retribution just for asking the question of, hey, you got somebody fired for using the N-word, and just basically asking a question. You used the same language on Twitter. And how are you living with yourself knowing that you are actively involved in somebody else's being fired for having used the same word that you used? And so instead of being an adult about it, she doxed this reporter. I kept calling him Alex. It's Aaron. I apologize. She keeps doxing Aaron, or she doxed Aaron, and she receives no blowback from Twitter. That is bananas on so many levels. But I guess I should expect nothing less from Twitter, considering that they peddled in child pornography for months on end until the Department of Justice had to get involved. You had teenage boys basically go, hey, there is sexually explicit content of me up on Twitter. Please take it down. Please. This is ruining my life. It gets spread 250,000 times, and not until the Department of Justice steps in, they refuse to take it down. They said, well, if you have a copyright violation issue, we'd be more than happy to take it down if you can prove that content is yours. They're like, copyright violation? I am a teenager. Take down those photos. Take down that video. Twitter is a disgusting company. Jack Dorsey should be ashamed of himself. Hannah Jones later deleted the tweet. So I already read what Aaron tweeted about it took over 24 hours to do so. And then a lady, Uchi Blackstock, MD, basically replied, LOL. And he included his phone number and thought you would actually call him. Shaking my head. And then Hannah Jones says, girl, with the emoji with the girl with a hand on her face. It is as yet unclear as to whether Hannah Jones thinks she should be let go from her Times post for doing the very thing McNeil was let go for, repeating a slur that another previously used in the context of an intellectual conversation about the use of the term itself, which is an important conversation to have. If you can't have a conversation about words and thoughts, then you can't have a conversation at all. Let's start banning words willy-nilly. I understand it because intent does matter, right? So if you have a question about, or if I'm reading a book written 100 years ago and it uses that language in it, then if I'm writing a book report, how am I supposed to reference that book report, right? How am I supposed to have a conversation with a teacher about it? I even had a problem when I was in university, right? When I was getting my degree in philosophy, I was reading Nietzsche's and the Genealogy of Morals, and he talks about the master and slave mentality of basically ethics and the way they respond to their struggles in life, right? One sees things as good or bad, right? Something is good or something is bad. And then you have the slave mentality, which is good and evil, which there's a difference between good and evil, right? Because you see something as bad and you're just like, that's bad. But then you see something as evil and it just like stirs up the pot inside and it makes you extremely angry when it happens. But when you have the master mentality, you see something as bad, you just want to get rid of that bad thing, right? Because it's just inconveniencing you. It's causing you to not be as successful, right? It's not really something evil. It's just bad. And bad things should be punished. That's it. and they don't really take pleasure in punishing a bad act. It's just part of what needs to be done. That's the difference between the slave and master mentality. When the slave sees an evil act and they have their chance for retribution, they take pleasure in getting their skin back, right? If that makes any sense. So they take pleasure in beating the master who may have stolen from the slave, whereas when a master beats the slave for having stole from him, he doesn't really take pleasure in that, according to Nietzsche, right? So he doesn't take pleasure from that. He's just basically saying, I'm going to teach you your lesson, and that's that. He doesn't basically derive pleasure from that act, whereas the slave would get pleasure and is excited for the chance of basically fighting back towards the master. It's a pretty interesting read. It's been a while since I read it. It's been a couple years. I think I'm going to read it again. I'm thinking about, on a side note, basically starting to do culture segments, talking about fitness, talking about philosophy. That's something I'm a little more subject matter expert in. Definitely not an expert in any sense of the word, but I have a degree in philosophy nonetheless. But I feel like, talking about culture, talking about, philosophy, Greek, German, all this stuff is going to be extremely important to learn about history, to learn about how things are going to play out, because great thinkers of the past actually did a very good job describing how events tend to unfold. And I'm a big fan of that stuff. Aaron posted on Twitter Monday night that Hannah Jones' tweet had been removed and that it was more annoying than alarming. Some nasty voice messages, but nothing serious. So it's disgusting. People need to be held accountable. There needs to be one standard. And I believe that's one thing I've been fairly consistent on this YouTube channel is, please, for the love of God, just have one standard. If we are not to use a certain language, then everybody should be punished for having used that language. If somebody, especially since that guy was punished for having said it years ago, I don't know if they had the date on which he actually used it. So they just said some years ago, but I think it was like 2012. It was a long time ago. So Nicole Hannah Jones had used that language more recently than the individual who was fired. So and if you want to basically use a logical argument, as the culture evolves, right? And basically using that language has become more and more taboo, then she should have known more better than he knew back in, I guess, early 2010s. Let's see exactly when he did this. Let's see. Let's quick DuckDuckGo search. McNeil N-word, when did this occur? Let's see what DuckDuckGo doesn't really say. He was caught instructing a student about racism in 2019, and in doing so said, oh, so he did this in 2019? Let's see. Let's see exactly when this happened. I guess this happened last year or 2 years ago. I heard it happened earlier than that, so I'm sorry about saying that it happened before that, but still, one standard, right? So if you have two reporters that have said the same word, but you only fire one, what do you think is going to happen? What do you think is going to happen with the work spirit, right? People are going to go, I am not going to cross this woman because she's going to see to it that I get fired. Why does this woman have more power than anybody else in the organization? Why is she so influential? Why is it when she snaps her fingers, things happen? And it's usually not something good. It's kind of disgusting. But that's going to be it for now, friends. I'm going to be posting another video here in a little bit. Until next time, see you later. Bye.